I didn't go looking for a bobcat. I was just sweeping the porch like I do every morning when I noticed something off. Not frightening, just quiet. A stillness in the trees like the forest was holding its breath. Out here in the foothills of Wyoming, wildlife is part of the rhythm. Elk in the distance, a hawk overhead. Sometimes even a fox slips through the garden. But this was different. It wasn't just the way the pine needles rustled or the soft paw prints in the frost. It was the feeling that something was watching. Not with hunger, but with hesitation, like it was waiting for permission. I brushed it off at first. A stray shadow, a trick of morning light. But the next day the prints returned, then the next. And one morning just before sunrise, I caught a glimpse of a small, scruffy figure half hidden behind the woodpile. Wild, wary, beautiful. A young bobcat cub. Alone. You don't expect moments like that to change your life. But sometimes all it takes is one pair of eyes looking back at you, not with fear, not with trust, but with a silent question. Is it safe to hope here? And that's where this story begins. A story of healing companionship and the kind of quiet rescue that changes more than one life. So make yourself a cup of tea. Turn down the noise of the world for a while, because this isn't just another cute animal video. This is about finding connection in the most unexpected places. Let me tell you what happened. When the woods sent me someone to love. I always thought the woods behind my cabin had their own language. Not in the magical sense, but in the way the wind through pine needles hums a little lower just before snow. Or how the birds fall quiet when something unfamiliar moves through. It's subtle, but if you live close enough long enough, you begin to hear it. Not with your ears exactly, more like a hum in your chest. That morning in early November, the hum was different. It started with the porch light flickering at dawn. I figured it was the wiring again. Out here in Afton, Wyoming, things break down slowly and quietly. Much like people, I suppose? I didn't think much of it until I stepped outside with my coffee and saw them paw prints. Not round and domestic like the neighbor's old golden retriever. No, these were spaced out, light-footed, careful. Wild. Still small, but not kitten small. Something in between. I bent down, fingers grazing the frost-covered wood. 3 pads and a heel mark, distinct. I wasn't a wildlife tracker, but 30 years of teaching biology to middle schoolers gives you enough knowledge to tell a house cat from something that doesn't want to be seen. The prints led off the porch into the dry grass and disappeared beneath the cedar bushes that lined the edge of my yard. I stood for a moment, watching the stillness, listening. I didn't hear rustling. I didn't see anything. But I felt watched. Not in a sinister way, just observed. I whispered mostly to myself, well, hello, whoever you are. That was the first morning Coda came. Not that I called him that yet. Back then, he was just a shadow that didn't leave a name. He didn't come every day. Sometimes there'd be nothing for 3 or 4 mornings. And then again, the prints, or a broken twig, or just that feeling, that low humming stillness. It's funny how quickly you start expecting someone you've never really met. At first, I didn't think about it too deeply. Maybe it was a young lynx or a bobcat traveling through. This part of the country has its share of wildcat babies who wander farther than they mean to. Still, it didn't feel like a passing visitor. It felt deliberate. Then came the morning with the turkey. I was clearing out the fridge before Thanksgiving prep, tossing leftovers into a bowl for the compost. But I paused. Took a piece of roasted turkey, just a bit, the good part with the skin still on, and placed it on a small ceramic dish. Without thinking, I set it just off the edge of the porch. No cameras, no expectations, just a quiet offering. That night I checked the dish. Clean, licked dry, but the bowl hadn't moved an inch. So I tried again the next day, and the next. Once I left the kitchen light on, angled, so it cast a glow just past the porch steps. I stood behind the curtain, waiting. And there he was. Not as large as I'd imagined, but not a house cat. Slim, his fur a little patchy at the ribs, paws too big for his frame, like he hadn't quite grown into himself yet. He moved like liquid smoke, shoulders low, head high, ears twitching. Every few steps he froze, checked his surroundings. No rush, just wariness. It was the kind of body language you only see in animals that have had to learn caution too young. He sniffed the food, blinked slowly, and ate in silence. No gulping, just soft bites, as if taking more than needed would be risky. It wasn't pity I felt exactly. It was something deeper. Recognition. I'd lost my husband 3 winters ago. Then my dog Scout. After that, the house became quieter than I could bear. I'd always been good with solitude, but grief is a different kind of quiet. A weight, not a space. And when I saw this bobcat cub, too young to be entirely alone, I didn't see something broken. I saw something unfinished, like he hadn't decided yet whether the world was safe. Like I hadn't either. He left before the sun came up, vanished into the woods as easily as he arrived. And yet I couldn't stop thinking about him. I wondered if he'd had siblings, if his mother were gone, or worse, if someone had tried to raise him, then gave up and turned him loose when he grew less cute and more wild. It happens more than people think. A baby bobcat is adorable until it's not, and then they're abandoned, tossed into the wilderness they've never truly learned to survive. That theory haunted me most. So I adjusted, started leaving food at consistent hours. Put an old fleece blanket under the covered porch, not too close to the door, just close enough to keep off the wind. Some days he came, others he didn't, but every time I heard birds scatter at dawn or noticed a soft shuffle beneath the stairs, I knew he was nearby, watching, waiting. One early morning while sipping tea, I whispered through the screen door, "You can stay if you want." He didn't respond, not then. But the next day, the blanket was slightly bunched. In those early weeks, I didn't tell anyone. Not because I was hiding it, but because I wasn't sure what to say. A wild animal has started visiting me, and I think we're becoming acquaintances. It didn't feel like the kind of thing people would understand. And honestly, I wasn't sure I understood it either. Yet that silence between us, it held something important. He didn't need me to talk, and I didn't need him to act tame. We were 2 quiet creatures navigating a world that had moved too fast, lost too much, and forgotten how to sit still. Looking back, I think that's what made the bond possible. I didn't ask anything of him. I didn't name him. I didn't try to make him into a pet. I just kept showing up. And so did he. There's a small lesson in that one I didn't learn in classrooms or textbooks. Sometimes trust doesn't come from grand gestures. It doesn't come from rescuing or fixing. It comes from consistency, from being where you said you'd be, from leaving the door open but never pulling anyone through it. That winter, I learned more about quiet companionship than I had in years. And every morning when I spotted the fresh paw prints, I felt something in me soften, like a page being turned slowly, a chapter not yet titled, but beginning nonetheless. I never meant to write this story, but I suppose some stories find you when you stop trying so hard to be found. Eventually, he didn't just take the food. He stayed a little longer, sat on the steps, looked up at the door, and one morning I swear I heard it, the woods whispering again. But this time it wasn't a warning. It was a welcome. But trust isn't a moment. It's a process. And the real turning point came one day when the wind was howling louder than usual and the porch was covered in snow. That's when Coda made a decision. And everything changed. There's a moment with wild animals, especially the quiet ones, when they stop seeing you as a threat. But they don't quite see you as safe either. You become part of the landscape, not friend, not foe, just there, reliable. Predictable. That's where we were, Coda and I. After the first weeks of him coming and going like mist through trees, something began to shift. Not dramatically, no big scene, just a subtle rearranging of boundaries. One morning he lingered longer than usual near the steps. Another day he ate before I closed the door. And then came the day he didn't bolt when I cracked the screen open to refill his water dish. He stood there, still, his stone eyes locked on me. I didn't move, not an inch. I just whispered, "You're okay," and slowly backed away. That was the first step of many in what I've come to call our silent dance. We never rehearsed it, but we both learned the steps. Him inching forward, freezing, checking for danger. Me keeping routines, softening my movements, never pushing. Looking back, it felt like choreography built on mutual restraint. He never ran toward me, and I never reached for him. Trust, I was learning, isn't a switch. It's not an all-or-nothing moment. It's a slow drip built in quiet, repeated motions. And in Coda's case, trust looked like this: a nose twitch before stepping onto the porch. A twitch of the ear when I opened the door. A long pause between bites, checking if I was watching. He was still very much a wildcat baby, unsure of the line between danger and safety. And I was learning how to sit in that space with him, not to fix it, not to change it, just to honor it. Each day I'd leave out food on the same dish in the same place at the same time. He began showing up closer to the hour. He'd perch at the edge of the brush, tail twitching, eyes locked on the bowl. Sometimes he'd wait for me to leave. Other times he'd start eating even while I stood a few feet away behind the screen. Progress in inches. One morning in December, the snow was falling lightly, the kind that floats more than it drops. I'd left a few slices of cooked chicken, knowing it was his favorite. But I also left something else, an old scarf, folded and set beside the bowl. Not for him to wear, of course, but for scent. Something familiar, something soft. He didn't go near it at first, but 2 days later, I noticed it was crumpled slightly. His prints were over it. And later, I watched him curl his paws just beside it while he ate. I didn't cry, but I felt that tight ache in the chest, the kind that comes when something unexpectedly beautiful happens and you're not sure how to hold it. Something was healing in that gesture, as if he'd accepted not just the food but the care behind it. Not long after, he began showing up twice a day, dawn and dusk. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, but then I realized I was adjusting to his rhythm, or maybe he was adjusting to mine. At sunrise, I'd sit by the window with a warm cup of tea. I didn't stare, just waited. I'd hear a rustle, then silence, then soft steps. And there he'd be. Tail low, shoulders forward, eyes always watching. At dusk, the same routine, same dance. He'd approach just close enough to eat in the fading light. Sometimes he'd pause on the steps afterward, just sitting, still watching, never too close. And yet it was close enough to feel like something sacred. During this time, I started keeping a journal, not just for him, but for myself, a way to track the days. My entries were simple. Day 14. He looked at me longer today, held my gaze. That's something right. Day 21. Left the door open a crack. He didn't come in, but he noticed. Day 28. I think he's listening to my voice now. Head tilts slightly when I speak. Funny how writing things down made them feel more real, more deliberate, more valuable. One evening, right before the new year, something happened that stayed with me. I had just stepped outside with his dinner, and before I could return inside, he appeared out of the blue. We both froze. Not out of fear, but surprise. We were only 6 feet apart. I didn't move. My breath caught slightly. I could hear the soft crunch of snow beneath his paws as he took one cautious step, then another, then stopped. We stood like that for a long minute. His eyes were wide but unafraid, my knees slightly bent, ready to back off if he needed space. Then I whispered, "Hey, you." And for the first time, he sat down. Right there, in the snow, facing me. He didn't eat, didn't approach further, but he stayed, as if to say, "I see you now." And I knew in that moment this was more than curiosity. This was the beginning of understanding. I've read books on animal behavior. I know about survival instincts territory and defensive postures. But nothing in those books quite prepares you for the quiet intimacy of being accepted by a creature with no reason to trust you. Coda wasn't tame. He wasn't domesticated. He was simply choosing to allow me near him. And that's a powerful thing, to be chosen quietly by something wild. I began to wonder how many of us are like that, waiting for someone to show up gently without asking for anything, just offering a space we don't have to run from. There's a lesson there, I think. In a world that moves so fast, demands so much, sometimes the bravest thing we can do is move slowly. Say less, show up, repeat. This slow building of trust changed the shape of my days. I found myself moving with more intention, breathing deeper, listening more. Even my neighbors noticed. One asked why I kept looking toward the woods. I smiled. Just someone I've been getting to know. I didn't explain. How could I? There was no video I could show, no footage, just impressions, a rhythm, a silent dance. There were, of course, setbacks. Days he didn't come. A night when I heard a coyote howl too close for comfort. Mornings when the food sat untouched and frozen. Each time I worried. Each time I reminded myself wild things come and go. They aren't bound by our timelines or expectations, and yet Coda always returned. Not always when I expected, but always when I needed, and each return brought a new step. A longer pause, a softer blink, a sign that we were moving together towards something neither of us had words for. I think that's the magic of animal companionship, especially with creatures that were never meant to belong to us. You don't earn it with treats or training. You earn it with time, with stillness, with the kind of love that doesn't need to be named. Eventually, he began brushing past the edge of the porch to sit by the steps while I drank tea inside. Never touching, never asking, just being there. The porch, once just a space between the woods and the house, became our shared ground. Not mine, not his, ours. And it's there one winter morning that something unexpected happened. The storm had been howling since midnight. Snow piled high against the door, and just as I reached to open it, I saw him, ears flattened fur dusted with ice. He didn't hesitate. That morning, for the very first time, Coda stepped inside. It started with the wind. All night, it pushed against the cabin, testing the seams of old windows and the edges of the roof. The kind of Wyoming winter wind that doesn't howl, it presses. It leans, it reminds you that you're small and that out here nature still writes the rules. I hadn't seen Coda the day before. Not at dawn, not at dusk. That wasn't entirely unusual. He skipped meals sometimes. But with the forecast warning of ice and plunging temperatures, I felt the worry nudge at my chest harder than usual. He was still just a bobcat cub after all, still a baby in many ways. That morning I shuffled out of bed early, wrapped in the same heavy-knit cardigan I'd worn every winter since Michael passed. I set the kettle and lit the stove, and before the water boiled, walked to the door with the habit of a woman who always leaves something out for someone who might come. I opened the door a few inches, and there he was. Coda stood just at the edge of the porch, ears low, whiskers stiff. His coat had turned darker in the wet flakes of snow clinging to the tufts behind his neck. His tail curled close to his side, and his front paw lifted slightly off the cold wood as if it stung. He didn't move, just looked up. It wasn't the same look as before, not the guarded, ready-to-run look I'd grown used to. This time his eyes weren't just cautious, they were asking. I didn't speak, didn't step forward. I simply opened the door all the way and walked back inside, leaving it open behind me. I sat down on the floor across from the entry, far from the threshold, and waited. Minutes passed, then one paw, then two. One. Slow, deliberate, nearly silent, he crept inside, no more than 2 feet past the door. He didn't explore. He didn't sniff around. He just stood in the warm light, wet fur, glistening eyes on me the entire time, Alta. This was not a wild animal being tamed. This was a wild animal making a choice, and it felt sacred. I'd laid an old towel down near the wood stove the night before, just in case. He noticed it. His eyes flicked to the fire, then back to me. I nodded slightly more to steady my own breath than to encourage him. Slowly he stepped forward, circled once, and curled into a tight, shivering ball. I didn't move for a long time. I just watched the snow fall outside, steam curling up from my tea and the bobcat cub breathing slowly on the towel near the fire. It was the quietest joy I've ever known. I'd been careful up to that point, never to push, never to invite too much. But this wasn't about an invitation anymore. It was about need. Coda wasn't giving up his wildness. He was choosing comfort in the middle of discomfort, choosing something warmer, gentler, safer. And isn't that what we all do when we're hurting? The old Joanna, before loss, before loneliness settled in, might have reached out, tried to touch him right then. But I knew better now. Healing doesn't like urgency. It needs room. So I stayed on my side of the room and let the moment settle. After about 20 minutes, Coda lifted his head. His ears twitched at the sounds inside the cabin floorboards, creaking, the tick of the stove expanding. He stood, shook out the damp, and walked deliberately slowly back toward the door. I didn't follow. I didn't speak. He glanced back once before slipping outside, tail brushing against the frame as he left. The door swung gently behind him, and I stood there a while longer, feeling the strange mixture of gratitude and ache that comes when something beautiful is fleeting by nature. That was the first time Coda came inside. It wouldn't be the last. The next day I found his paw prints by the porch again, but no sign of him. Then the next evening, right before the last light faded, he came back. This time there was no storm, no desperate cold, just a gentle snowfall and a sense of curiosity. He stepped inside again, took 3 steps farther this time, paused at the edge of the rug, sat tail curled neatly, as if he were trying to understand what this space was, what it meant. I stayed in the kitchen just far enough away, slicing sweet potatoes for dinner. I talked softly, not to him, just aloud, about nothing in particular, the way I used to when Scout was alive, the way I talked when I was still someone's wife. It's strange how quickly routine builds itself around another being, even when they don't speak, don't answer, don't stay long. That night after he left, I found a single piece of dried leaf near the towel. It clung to the edge of the fabric like it had been brought in from the woods, a kind of silent offering. I left it there. Some people might say this was just survival, that a wild animal seeks warmth when it's cold and nothing more. And they might be right. But I also know the difference between instinct and intention. And there was something deeply intentional in the way Coda looked at me before stepping inside. It reminded me of how people make decisions when they've been hurt. Slowly, with hesitation, but with hope. I started to notice something else during those early visits. The way he listened, not to my words, but to the tone, the rhythm. I'd read once that wild animals respond more to energy than sound, and that made sense. I began to move more slowly in my house. Open and close cabinets with care. Leave one light on, never more. Play soft music in the evenings, mostly piano and ambient forest sounds. Not because I wanted to train him, but because I wanted him to know this space was consistent, predictable, safe. And slowly, the space between us began to shrink. The towel by the stove became his default resting place. He never stayed long, 30 minutes, maybe 40 on a cold day. But the visits became regular, always on his terms, never prompted, and always quiet. That winter, I rearranged the living room. Not for decoration, but to give Coda a clear path from door to stove unobstructed. A kind of invitation made not with words, but with respect. I didn't realize until much later how symbolic that act was, clearing a space for someone who might only visit, but still mattered. And isn't that what healing looks like? Making space. Not asking someone to change, not hoping they stay, just opening the door and making space for when they do. That's when I understood what Coda was teaching me. It wasn't about rescuing a wild animal. It wasn't even about companionship. It was about allowing the connection to grow without force, without expectation, with patience. Coda reminded me that love in its truest, gentlest form never insists. It waits, and when it's ready, it steps forward on its own. I hadn't planned to give him a name, but after weeks of quiet company, it felt wrong to keep calling him the bobcat. He had earned more than that. And so, I named him, and in that naming something changed again. I hadn't planned to name him. That was the line I'd drawn for myself early on. No naming, no claiming, no crossing the line between witness and keeper. He was a wild cat, and I was just a woman who left out bits of turkey and warmth. That boundary kept things safe for both of us. But as weeks turned into months and the visits stretched longer, the silence between us began to shift. It wasn't just the absence of noise anymore. It had weight, intention, and one morning I found myself talking to him without realizing it. Not whispering like before, not murmuring "hey there" from behind the screen. No, this time I actually said something. "You need a name, don't you?" He was curled up on the same towel by the stove. It was still early and the snow hadn't stopped since the night before. He didn't look up, but his ears twitched slightly, the way they always did when he was pretending not to listen. I poured my tea and sat nearby, back resting against the cabinet. "I keep calling you boy or visitor, but that doesn't feel right anymore." Still no movement, just the soft sound of his breath. Names matter. I learned that the hard way. Years ago, when Michael and I adopted Scout, our retriever mix, I wanted to call him Rusty, but Michael insisted we wait. "Let's see who he is," he said. "Let's not choose for him too fast." And so we waited. Scout was quiet, observant, gentle with strangers, and always a step behind us when we walked, like he didn't want to lead or follow, just be close. "He's always scouting," Michael said. And that was it. Scout. A name born not of preference, but of truth. So when I began thinking about the bobcat, I asked myself the same thing. Who is he? He was quiet, but not fearful anymore. He was cautious, but not closed. He came and went like a tide, never taking more than needed, but always arriving with some unspoken message. He was a presence, like the woods themselves. That evening, I pulled out an old book of Lakota and Algonquin stories, something Michael had once used in his classroom. He loved sharing animal tales from Native American folklore with his students. Always said animals carried truths. We were too distracted to see. I wasn't looking for a name, not exactly. Just inspiration. But there, on page 43, in a story about a bear who becomes a boy's guardian spirit, I found it. Coda. It meant friend in Dakota Sioux, or sometimes ally. And it felt right. That word settled into my chest like it had always been there, waiting. The next morning I said it aloud. Coda. He was perched by the sliding door watching a squirrel dart across the snow. I didn't expect a response, but he turned his head slowly, eyes meeting mine, and blinked. I smiled. Yeah, that's you. I never called him anything else after that. Giving Coda a name didn't change him. It changed me. It allowed me to see him not just as a wild animal passing through my life, but as someone with his own rhythm, his own story. It gave structure to our bond, a shape, a center. Naming is risky, I know. It implies belonging. And belonging can bring loss. But it can also bring grounding. Naming someone says, I know you're real. I see you. And how many of us, human or not, go through life without ever really being seen? After that day, I found myself talking to him more. Not in the way one talks to pets with high voices and nicknames, but plainly, honestly. Morning, Coda. It's warm today, you'll like the sun. Or I made extra rice, left some near the porch. Sometimes I just narrate my day, thinking of calling my sister, but she'll probably talk about the HOA meeting again. Or I miss Scout today. You'd have liked him. It wasn't a conversation, but it was a connection. Coda never meowed or chirped like domestic cats do, but he'd look up when I spoke, tilt his head when I asked questions, flick his ears when I laughed. Sometimes that was all the company I needed. One rainy afternoon, while sorting through a drawer of old photos, I found a picture of Michael and me from our first summer at the cabin. Scout was in the middle tongue, outpaws muddy. I sat there for a long time staring at that photo. Not crying, just remembering. Coda was nearby, curled against the doorframe. I looked up and said softly, "This place has held a lot of love, you know." He didn't move, but somehow I felt understood. It's strange how a creature without words can become such a part of your life. But love doesn't need a language. And naming something doesn't mean you own it. Sometimes it just means you've made room for it to exist in your heart. There was a shift after that, subtle but steady. Coda came more often, stayed longer. He began to approach the open door without hesitation. Never demanded to be inside, but accepted the space when it was offered. He'd eat rest, then vanish back into the forest like smoke. And each time he left, I said, "See you soon, Coda." Because now, I wasn't speaking to a bobcat, I was speaking to him. Sometimes I wondered if he would stay for good. Move in fully, but deep down I knew he never would. Or maybe never should. He belonged to the in-between, to both the wild and the warmth. And maybe that's what made our bond so meaningful. It existed in the fragile space between freedom and trust, between instinct and connection, between being alone and being seen. There's a lesson in that, I think, about how we love. So many people try to pull love close, contain it, define it, hold it tight. But some kinds of love don't want to be held. They want to be met, witnessed, named, and allowed to roam. Coda was never mine, but I was his. That winter, as his coat thickened and his body grew stronger, I began to notice how much I'd changed too. I no longer filled my silence with news or noise. I no longer felt the constant ache of loneliness in the evenings. The house was still quiet, but it wasn't empty, and that made all the difference. Naming Coda didn't erase the grief I carried, but it made room beside it for something new, something alive. And in doing so, it allowed me to believe again in companionship, in wildness, in second chances. But not everyone saw it that way. When I told a friend about Coda, really told her, she couldn't hide the concern in her voice. "A bobcat, Joe, in your house," and just like that I realized, not everyone understands a bond that doesn't fit neatly into a box. When something begins to feel natural to you, gentle, familiar, even sacred, you forget how strange it might seem to others. For months, my daily rhythm had quietly rearranged itself around Coda. The tea kettle still whistled at dawn. The firewood still needed stacking, but now there were pauses, silent, intentional spaces carved out for the presence of a wild cat who had somehow become part of my life. To me, it didn't feel dramatic. It didn't even feel extraordinary anymore. It just was. But to others, it didn't always look that way. It started with a phone call. My friend Claire from Idaho, retired nurse, opinionated fiercely. Logical, was planning to visit for the weekend. "Don't fuss about the guest room," she said. "I'll sleep on the couch if I have to. Just want to see your face." She hadn't been out here since before Michael passed. I was looking forward to seeing her again. But I also knew that at some point during her visit, she'd meet Coda, and I wasn't sure how that would go. The first night she arrived, everything was warm and easy. We cooked together like old times. She chopped too fast, I seasoned too slowly. We talked about our knees, our grown children, the things that quietly ache when you're not looking. Then the next morning, as light poured in through the kitchen windows, Coda appeared. He didn't come in, just hovered at the porch steps, ears perked, waiting. I was setting down his bowl when Claire turned from the sink and froze. "Is that a bobcat?" she asked. I nodded. She blinked. "A bobcat-like. Wild bobcat." "His name's Coda," I said quietly. She stepped back from the window. "Joanna, are you feeding a wild animal?" "Inside your house." I didn't answer right away. I just watched him eat as I always did, slow, cautious, but no longer fearful. Claire crossed her arms. "You know that's dangerous, right? They don't belong in homes. This isn't a Disney movie." Her tone wasn't cruel, just sharp, protective. I turned to her and said, "He's not in a home. He's near one, that's all. And he chooses when and if he comes." She shook her head. "Joe, he's not a pet. What if he turns? What if one day he snaps and he's not a pet?" I interrupted. "He's a presence, that's all." We didn't speak about it again that morning. But the air shifted. That afternoon, Claire sat on the porch with a book. I watched as Coda crept up from the woods and paused at the edge of the clearing. He didn't approach, didn't come near, just watched. Claire saw him too. Her hand stilled on the page. He stared. She stared. Then he vanished. And I think something softened in her just slightly. Later that evening, she said, "He's beautiful, I'll give you that." I smiled. "He's also careful. That's part of what I love." But not everyone softened. A few weeks later, I shared a photo of Coda sleeping by the stove. Nothing dramatic, just his ears poking up behind a basket of firewood. I posted it to a private group online for wildlife lovers. The comments came quickly. "You shouldn't be encouraging this kind of behavior. He's still dangerous. You're playing with fire. This is illegal in some states. Do you even know the laws? Wild animals need to stay wild." There were kind words too, but they got buried beneath the chorus of concern. I logged off after that. I understood where they were coming from. I really did. I wasn't naive. I knew bobcats weren't meant to be tamed, raised like pets, made into cute animal videos for entertainment. But that wasn't what this was. Coda came and went as he pleased. He hunted on his own. He never sought touch, never begged for food. He didn't wear a collar or sleep on my bed. He lived outside, free. But he also chose to come near, to rest here, to listen. And in return, I gave him something many animals and people rarely receive space without conditions. Still, the conversations stuck with me. I began questioning things. Was I blurring a line? Had I convinced myself this was a connection when it was really just convenience for me or for him? That night, as I sat on the porch, Coda appeared again. No food in sight, no storms, just a quiet evening. He stepped up onto the porch slowly and lay down about 5 feet from me. His body relaxed, eyes half closed. And we sat like that for nearly an hour. Not a performance, not a story for the internet. Just two beings sharing quiet. In that silence, I realized something: not every bond needs to be understood by others to be valid. Some people adopt animals. Some rescue them. Some protect them from a distance. Others connect in strange sacred ways that fall somewhere in between. This, whatever it was between me and Coda, didn't need labels. It just needed respect. There's a lesson here I carry with me now. One I wish I'd known earlier in life, Paul. Not everyone will understand your choices, especially the ones rooted in quiet love. And that's okay. You don't owe anyone proof that something is meaningful. Sometimes the world moves too fast to see what you've taken time to build slowly. Sometimes people mistake gentleness for weakness, or boundaries for carelessness. And sometimes their fear is just love in disguise. Wanting to protect you from things they don't trust, but love that demands understanding from everyone isn't really love at all. It's approval, and those are not the same. Over time, I stopped explaining Coda to people who didn't ask with real curiosity. I started guarding our bond, like I would a tender garden open to the sun but fenced from careless feet. My closest friends, the ones who knew my quiet, who remembered the ache that followed Michael in Scout, they came to understand. Not because I convinced them, but because they saw me smile again. They heard it in my voice. They saw it in the way I spoke Coda's name with steadiness. Some even came to visit and saw him themselves. A few didn't. That's all right. Because healing doesn't require an audience. It only requires presence. And Coda, he continued to show up. Not every day, but often enough to remind me I wasn't imagining any of it. He was still a wild animal. And I was still a woman learning to love without needing to keep. But somehow, in all that unspoken space, we found home in each other. As the snow melted and spring began to show its face again, something shifted in both of us. Coda stayed longer, listened more, walked beside me as I worked in the garden, and in those quiet, shared hours, I started to see just how much he had changed me. Healing is quiet. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It doesn't ask permission. Sometimes it just tiptoes in wearing soft paws and golden eyes, and you don't realize it's there until everything in you feels lighter. That's how it was with Coda. After that long winter passed and the snow began to retreat from the hills behind the cabin, he started staying longer. Not every day, not in any predictable pattern, but enough to notice. Enough to feel like something steady had taken root between us. He'd nap on the back porch, legs stretched out, tail twitching in the sun. Sometimes he'd follow me as I walked the trail behind the house, never too close, never quite touching, but always there in the periphery. Watching, walking in rhythm. I never tried to change him, never wanted to, but I could see the changes all the same. He'd stopped flinching when I opened the screen door. He no longer froze at sudden sounds or gusts of wind. Once I dropped a pan and braced for him to bolt, but he just blinked, flicked his ear, and went back to grooming. There was a softness in him now, still wild, still wary, but softened by familiarity, by trust. And I began to notice the same thing in myself. Before Coda, I was functioning. I was keeping the house clean, paying bills, and answering the occasional call from family. I smiled at the right times. I cooked simple meals. I even laughed now and then. But inside I was still quiet in that hollow kind of way. The kind that feels like your heart is walking barefoot on cold wood floors. Then Coda began showing up, and the quiet shifted. It became shared. Not lonely, just still. A stillness that felt full rather than empty. It's strange, I know, to say that a wildcat helped me feel human again, but it's true. He didn't do anything dramatic. He didn't cuddle. He didn't love me in the way people expect animals to show affection. He never once licked my hand or brushed up against my leg. But he stayed. And in doing so, he taught me the most important thing I'd forgotten, that presence is a form of love too. One of my favorite memories happened on a gray afternoon in late spring. I was sitting on the ground beside the raised garden beds, knees in the dirt, repotting herbs. My hands were muddy. My sleeves rolled up and my back ached in that dull, familiar way. I'd been silent for nearly an hour, just working. Then I felt it. Not a sound, just awareness. I looked up, and there was Coda, lying under the pine tree about 10 feet away, watching me. Not staring, not alert, just there. Like we were two old friends who didn't need to speak. I wiped my hands on my jeans, gave him a little nod, and kept working. That day, I didn't listen to music, didn't play the radio, just gardened in silence with Coda as company. And for the first time in years, I didn't need a distraction. I was just with someone, even if he never came closer than 10 feet. Coda taught me a lot that year. He taught me to move more slowly, to be softer with myself, to take time before responding, before acting, before filling a silence just because it's there. He taught me to pay attention, not just to the woods and the sky and the shifting seasons, but to my own thoughts, to how easily I'd gotten used to protecting myself from hope. Because here's the thing, after loss, hope can feel dangerous. It whispers promises. It makes you believe in things again. And when you've lost enough, you start guarding yourself from even the good things. Coda didn't heal that all at once, but he chipped away at it quietly, persistently. Every time he returned, every time he trusted me enough to sit by the stove or walk alongside me in the tall grass or simply look me in the eye without fear. He reminded me that not everything that leaves you broken is meant to be avoided forever. Some things, some bonds are worth the risk. One night I woke up around 3 a.m. There was a soft sound outside, barely more than the wind. I pulled on my robe, stepped to the porch, and there he was, sitting, waiting. Rain had just started to fall, and the sky was that deep navy blue that turns right before a storm. I opened the door, stepped aside. He came in. No hesitation. That was the first time he stayed through the night. He curled on the towel near the fire and didn't stir until morning. And when I woke, he was still there, eyes half closed, chest rising slowly, as if this cabin had always been home. That morning, as the sun stretched across the floorboards, I watched him sleep and realized I wasn't surviving anymore. I was living again. It wasn't grand, it wasn't sudden, but it was real. And all because one small bobcat chose to trust me one slow step at a time. These days I still think about how strange it would sound to someone who's never known this kind of companionship. How do you explain the comfort of watching a wild animal sleep safely in your home? How do you describe the peace that comes from not touching, not taming, just being? Coda wasn't a pet. He was a mirror, a companion, a quiet reminder that connection doesn't always look the way we expect. People think rescue stories are one-sided, that one party gives and the other receives. But this was mutual. I offered warmth. He offered trust. I gave space. He gave presence. And in that exchange, something in both of us began to mend. He didn't need to be saved. And maybe neither did I. Maybe I just needed to remember what it felt like to matter again. But just when it all felt steady, when I had settled into this quiet, healing rhythm, Coda didn't come. Not that day, not the next, not even by the weekend. And for the first time since our story began, I felt the old fear return, not for my safety, but for his. It happened in May. The trees had turned full with new green, the air was soft with birdsong, and the snow melt had made the creek behind my cabin run louder than usual. Everything about the season whispered life and movement, and yet Coda was gone. At first, I didn't panic. Wild animals roam. They follow instincts. I reminded myself of that. He'd always come and gone on his own terms. Sometimes he skipped a day or two, especially during spring when prey was plenty and the woods called louder than human companionship. But by day 3, something in my chest started to tighten. I still set out his food habit. Hope, stubbornness, I'm not sure which. Each morning the bowl sat untouched. No paw prints in the soil, no movement in the brush, just silence. I walked the property, I checked the trees he liked to rest under. Sat by the garden for hours, listened, waited. Still nothing. On day 5, I pulled Scout's old collar out of the drawer, the one I'd kept all these years. I'm not sure why. Maybe just to hold something that had once stayed. Something that hadn't wandered off. I sat with it in my lap on the porch and stared into the woods, asking a question I never said out loud. Was it over? That's the thing about loving anything untamed, whether it's an animal, a season of life, or even a person. You don't get guarantees. You only get presence for as long as it chooses to stay. I tried to stay rational. Told myself maybe he was following a migrating deer trail. Maybe a mate had drawn him farther out. Maybe he found a better food source. Maybe he'd outgrown the quiet rhythm we built. But grief doesn't speak the language of logic. It doesn't care that Coda was a wild bobcat cub, or that I had no right to expect him to stay. It only knows what's missing. And he was missing. By day 7, I stopped setting the food out. I couldn't bear the sight of it untouched. Couldn't stand the weight of waiting. It reminded me too much of the chair across from me at the dinner table after Michael passed the one I kept setting out of habit for too long. Loss comes in different forms, and this one was subtle soft. But it hurt just the same. I tried to distract myself. I walked more. Took up sketching again, though the pages stayed mostly blank. Watered the garden with more force than needed. Reorganized the pantry. But every small sound still pulled my eyes to the tree line. Every dusk I'd glance at the porch without meaning to, and every night I'd whisper, "Come back." On the 9th day, I woke early, before the sun. Something had stirred me, maybe a sound, maybe just restlessness. I walked barefoot to the front door and opened it, not expecting anything, just moving as grief does without clear direction. And there he was, Coda, standing at the edge of the porch, thinner than before, left ear nicked fur dusty with pollen. His eyes met mine, and for the first time in days I breathed. Not the shallow half-breaths I'd gotten used to, but a full, deep breath, the kind that fills your ribs and quiets your heart. I didn't speak, didn't move. I just stepped aside and opened the door. He walked in. No hesitation. Straight to the towel by the fire, even though there was no fire burning yet. He curled into himself, tail tucked, head low, but he didn't look afraid. He looked tired. I sat down on the floor a few feet away. Not to ask anything, just to witness. After a few minutes, he lifted his head and looked at me. No sound, no gesture, just a long, quiet gaze that said, "I'm here." And I answered with my own, "You were missed." Later that morning, I noticed a small cut on his back leg. Not deep, but enough to explain the change in his gait. He let me place a shallow bowl of warm water near him. Nothing more. I didn't try to touch. He didn't need tending, just time. That day I didn't do much. Didn't check email, didn't clean, didn't write. I just existed near him, letting presence be its kind of medicine. And as I watched him rest, I realized something I hadn't admitted during those empty days. It wasn't just fear of losing him. It was the fear of being left behind again, of building trust only to have it slip through my fingers, of daring to believe in connection only to be reminded that wild things don't stay. But Coda had come back. Not because he had to, not because I'd asked, but because for whatever reason this little corner of the world, this porch, this stove, this rhythm still called him home. And I think we all carry that longing. To go out into the world, to test our strength, to follow what pulls us forward, but also to return somewhere. To someone. To a place where we're remembered. The lesson Coda brought home with him wasn't about survival. It was about trust. About return. And that kind of trust, the kind that walks away then finds its way back, is a rare, quiet kind of love. In the days that followed, he stayed close, moved slower, slept longer, ate more. We didn't go back to normal right away, but we settled into a new rhythm, one shaped by absence but not defined by it. And strangely, I found that my fear had shifted, not gone but softened. Because now I knew something I hadn't known before. Even if he left again, the bond wouldn't. Even if he disappeared for good someday, what we'd built, care without ownership, presence without pressure, would remain. And that gave me peace. Coda didn't stay inside that long. By the third day, he was back to sleeping under the trees. But each night I still saw him circle the edge of the clearing. Sometimes he came to the door. Sometimes he didn't, but I no longer waited in fear. I waited in faith. Because when someone teaches you how to love without needing to possess you, stop fearing their absence. You start trusting their return. In time, Coda became more than just a wild visitor. He became part of my story and I part of his. And as the seasons passed and the years began to stack quietly on top of each other, I realized he hadn't just healed something in me. He'd given me back a reason to open the door. People often say they rescued an animal. They took in a stray, saved a shelter dog, and nursed a kitten. And maybe they did. Maybe that's true. But in the quiet of my cabin with Coda, resting on the edge of the porch, half in sun and half in shadow, I know something else he rescued me. I don't mean in the dramatic sense. There was no single moment, no sudden epiphany. Just 100 small ones, soft, steady, almost invisible unless you were looking. A bobcat cub, wild and uncertain, took cautious steps toward me. And as he did, I found myself stepping slowly, gently back into my own life. There was a time I'd stopped noticing beauty. The way steam curls so. Teacup. The hush right before snow falls. The way the pine trees breathe when the wind shifts. That all faded after Michael. And even after Scout, I told myself silence was easier. Simpler. But Coda changed that. Not all at once, but with time. It started with the routine fresh water, small bites of food, a folded towel near the stove. Then came the glances, the way he'd look at me and blink slowly, not in fear but acknowledgement. Then the days he'd walk beside me down the forest trail, silent, steady, as if we'd always belonged to the same rhythm. He reminded me of what it meant to stay present, not to rush grief, not to outrun loneliness, but to be in it, and to notice the light even when it came in flickers. There's something deeply humbling about bonding with a wild animal. A creature like a bobcat doesn't follow your rules, doesn't come when called, doesn't offer affection the way a dog might, or comfort the way a cat might curl into your lap. But when it chooses to share space with you on its terms, it means more. Because there's no transaction, just trust, and trust in its truest form is healing. I didn't realize how much I'd closed myself off until I began opening tiny parts of my day for him. Until I rearranged furniture, not for guests, but for an animal that might or might not arrive. Until I began waking up with a quiet sense of expecting something good. Not needing, just expecting. That kind of hope is gentle. It doesn't demand. It waits. And every time Coda returned, I felt it strengthen. He became more than a visitor. He became a mirror. Some mornings I'd find him watching the sunrise, just sitting on the hill. I started sitting beside him, not too close, but close enough to feel the stillness settle between us. Those were some of the most meaningful moments of my life. No words, no stories, just the weight of shared presence. I began noticing other things too, things I'd let fade. I started calling my sister more, started cooking meals that weren't just functional but comforting. I cleared out old things I hadn't touched in years and made space in the house. Not because I needed to, but because something inside me wanted to. Like life was quietly asking if I might want to live it again. I even caught myself humming. That was the moment I knew something had shifted. Grief never fully leaves you. I wouldn't want it to. It's part of the love. But it stopped being the only thing I felt. And that's something worth honoring. There's a kind of companionship we don't talk about enough, the kind that doesn't fit into neat labels. Coda wasn't a pet. He wasn't family in the traditional sense, but he mattered. He still does. And through him I learned that connection doesn't have to look like affection. Sometimes it looks like showing up, sitting nearby, returning even after disappearing. Wild animal rescue stories often focus on saving a creature from danger. But sometimes the wild animal brings the rescue, not through dependency, but through reminding us who we are. Coda taught me to slow down, to be curious again, to let go of control. He taught me that love doesn't always need to be loud or visible or explainable. Sometimes it's a wild cat choosing to rest near your door. And the most surprising part, I didn't realize how much I needed that kind of love until I received it. He never asked anything of me. He never once broke a thing, never scratched or snarled or took more than he needed. And in a world full of noise and rush and need, that kind of presence feels like peace. Over the years, our rhythm stayed much the same. I'd see him at dusk or dawn, sometimes both. He'd disappear for days, then return as if no time had passed. I never kept him, never tried. But I always kept the door cracked just in case. And every time he crossed the threshold, I felt the quiet miracle of it. People who visited would sometimes ask, "Aren't you afraid he'll stop coming one day?" And I'd smile and say he might. But what I meant was, he might not. And even if he did, he already gave me more than I ever asked for. He gave me back to myself. Now, years later, I still see traces of him. Prints in the mud near the garden. A warm spot on the porch where he curled. Once a tuft of fur caught on the edge of a bush, glinting in the morning light. Whether he's nearby or wandering, I carry him with me. Not as a pet, not as a project, but as a teacher. He reminded me that healing doesn't come in big waves. It comes in soft returns, in shared silences, in moments when you stop needing answers and start trusting presence. Coda didn't save me with grand gestures. He saved me with his absence and his return. He saved me by letting me watch something wild feel safe. And in doing so, he made me feel safe too. Maybe you felt something similar. Maybe you've lost someone or lost a part of yourself and found healing in something small. A stray animal, a quiet walk, a single moment of stillness. Maybe you're still waiting for that return. If you are, I want to say this: you're not alone. And healing has a funny way of finding us, especially when we least expect it. Sometimes it has fur, sometimes silence, sometimes claws, but always the potential to change us. So I invite you now to pause, breathe, ask yourself, what have I kept the door open for? And what might I be ready to welcome back in? If this story touched something in you, if Coda reminded you of a pet you once loved or a quiet friendship that changed you, consider liking this video, leave a comment, share your own story, and if you'd like more moments like this, more real animal rescue stories, more emotional connections between humans and the wild, click subscribe. There's more to come, because sometimes the most powerful bonds are the ones that begin with just a crack in the door.